Hi, this is Troy Hunt, and I'd like to talk to you about 5 internet security basics. These are things that you absolutely need to understand if you're working with online systems today, and really that's pretty much all of us. It's almost impossible to go about our daily lives without interacting with websites or mobile devices or other connected things that form a part of our everyday lives. As we gather more connected things and we collect more sensitive data, we expose ourselves more. We put ourselves at more risk of serious security incidents, more risk and a greater impact. And that's really just the nature of the way our digital lives have evolved. That's just a quick overview of what we're going to cover. Let's jump into it and start talking about some of those must-know security fundamentals. Very quickly about me before we get into the details of this course. I am Troy Hunt. I spend a lot of my time training people about how to better secure both their systems and their online lives. You'll often find me speaking around the world and spending my time with organizations and individuals helping them understand how to better protect themselves from today's online risks. You can find me on Twitter @TroyHunt or via my blog, which can be found at troyhunt.com. So that's it from me. Let's jump into it and start talking about why it's so important to discuss security. I'm going to talk about these 5 must-know security fundamentals throughout this course. And the first one is password. No, I don't mean passwords. I literally mean the word password, because this is consistently the most common password that people use in systems. Not just password. 123456 is also a very popular password, as is QWERTY. And QWERTY might sound like a strange password, but take a look at the keyboard and why people choose this password suddenly makes more sense. We're going to start by looking at the way people create passwords and some of the techniques we should be using to create better ones because we consistently get them so wrong. Now, of course, one of the places that we most frequently use passwords and frequently get them wrong is websites. And websites have got a lot of problems. One of the big issues we've got with websites is data breaches. We see a lot of them. And this is a great visualization of just how many data breach incidents we've seen occurring lately. For example, it was hard to miss the news in 2015 about the Ashley Madison hack. 37 million people having very personal information about their relationship status exposed online. A little bit later, it was the Anthem health insurer. There were 80 million people impacted in that one. And now we're talking about personal information such as dates of birth and social security numbers. Another one that demonstrated something many of us are concerned about these days is the Philippines Election Commission. Comelec had 55 million identities exposed in 2016. That is half the entire country, all exposed in one data breach. That included a huge amount of information ranging from passport details through to biometric data about their citizens. We're going to talk quite a bit about web security a little bit later on in the course. Another modern day online threat that's particularly malicious is ransomware. So we've been seeing strains of this malware encrypting people's files on their machines and then demanding a ransom before the files will be unlocked. Very often, these infections happen because people are running out-of-date software. Attackers exploit that. They know people are not real good at keeping their machines up to date. So we're going to talk about software maintenance, how to make sure you avoid running vulnerable versions of software which lead to infections like the one you see on the screen here. However, it's not just your PCs that are under attack. Mobile devices are now ubiquitous. You almost certainly have one within arm's reach right now as you're watching this course. We carry these little devices around with us everywhere we go. We take them to the bathroom. We sleep with them. They're rarely out of our sight. But they're also enormously attractive targets to attackers because they do literally contain our entire lives in them. And that poses a very attractive target. But when we talk about having valuable information on devices, these days it goes well beyond just phones. I'm also going to talk about the Internet of Things, IoT. And this is the premise that we should connect everything from refrigerators through to dog bowls, through to our cutlery. All of these things and many, many more are increasingly becoming Internet enabled. They're becoming part of the Internet of Things. Now, when you put computers in these everyday devices, you expose them to many of the risks that we see in more traditional computing devices, our PCs, our tablets, our phones. And that creates a whole new set of problems we have to deal with, problems that we haven't traditionally thought about. So that's just a quick overview of the 5 topics we're going to cover. We're going to look at not just what the risks are, but what are the actionable steps that you can take to avoid becoming a victim. Let's go and start by looking at passwords. Passwords are without a doubt the most common security construct that we work with. Barely a day goes by without us entering at least one password, or a PIN, or some other form of authentication to prove that we are who we are before we access some form of valuable resource. Yet, passwords are also one of the things that we most consistently get wrong. They're such a simple thing, yet they're so easy to do in an insecure fashion. Let's talk about where passwords usually go wrong. Most people probably know how they're meant to create passwords, but let's just recap briefly here before we move on and create some strong passwords. And I'm going to give you some good techniques to do that. So firstly, one of the things that people consistently get wrong with passwords is length. They create short passwords. And the simple reality of it is, the shorter the password, the more likely it is to be hacked. Obviously, people choose short passwords because they're easy. Less characters to remember, less characters to type. The problem is, it's also less characters for an attacker to have to get right. Now, that might be less characters they have to guess if they're trying to log on to someone's account online. It might be less characters they have to crack if they've broken into a website and stolen passwords that are cryptographically stored. The way we create passwords is just simply one of those intersections between convenience and security. The more convenient we make them, the less secure they become. But that's just one attribute. Another area that we struggle with is randomness. I gave you a few examples of different passwords in the introduction of this course. They were not random. The word password is not a random string of letters and numbers. It is a very, very predictable word. And when you think about it, there are a lot of very predictable passwords out there. Your dog's name is a very predictable password. And if you use that, you're making it exceptionally easy for people to figure out what your password is. Not only that, but if the password ever gets compromised somewhere and you have to change it, it makes life very hard on the dog as well. Don't use your dog's name or your children's name or your significant other's name or other obvious names for passwords. None of those pass the randomness test. One of the things you need to remember with randomness is that we're not just talking about lowercase letters. We're talking about a mix, lowercase, uppercase, numbers, non-alphanumeric characters, so things like punctuation. All of these contribute to this desirable password attribute of randomness. But even if you get these two things right, you have a long password and it's nice and random, There's another really big fatal flaw in the way people handle their passwords, and that's uniqueness. Now, the problem here is that people tend to have a password. When someone talks about their password, often it is just that, their one password that they use in many different places. Now, the issue here is that as soon as that password is disclosed in one place, anyone who holds it now effectively has the key into all the other places that that same password was used. So when you look at incidents like those data breaches that I just showed you in the introduction of the course, any one of those sites that's leaked someone's password puts all those other sites at risk as well. And this is what often happens. Password reuse means that one website gets hacked, the user's password gets taken, and then they suddenly see compromises on a whole bunch of accounts on totally different sites. Let me give you some examples of that. Here's the real issue with password reuse. Let me give you 3 simple examples. LinkedIn, Dropbox, and MySpace. 3 very big, very familiar names. In 2016, each one of these had very large amounts of data exposed publicly. LinkedIn, 165 million accounts. Dropbox had 69 million, and MySpace trumped them both with 359 million accounts exposed. Now, in a case like LinkedIn, if you had a password that met those 3 fatal flaws in the previous slide, length, randomness, uniqueness, and then you used it other places, now you've got a big problem, a much bigger problem than just your LinkedIn account. In fact, even if you had a very good password and it did pass the length and randomness tests, but then you failed the uniqueness test and you used it other places, you've still got a problem. We need a better way of handling passwords, how we create them, how we recall them, and then how we use them on websites. Let's go and start talking about some solutions. One of the alternatives to using a password, so that is just a single word as we would normally think of it, is to use what's referred to as a passphrase. So for example, instead of using the password or the dog's name, what if you used a phrase like this? What's Roger got for dinner? It doesn't have to make any sense. It just has to be something that you can use as a way of identifying yourself when you log on to websites. Now, this is great for length and it's great for randomness. This is not a common phrase. Don't go and use something out of Shakespeare or something that other people will have thought of. But it may not necessarily pass the requirement that many websites set forth. So for example, it doesn't have any numbers. It is actually a very good password, even without them, but it might not be enough to satisfy the requirements on the site you're using. So you might need to use character substitution as well. In this case, A's become an @ symbol, O's become zeros, E's become 3's, etc., etc. You've probably seen this form of character substitution in many different places before. And it's one other way of adding some degree of randomness to the password. Although it's worth noting, hackers have worked this out. They know that people do these common character substitutions. But in combination with quite a unique passphrase, this is not a bad password. Sometimes we find there are other barriers to using a password like this on a website. So for example, the website might say, you can't have apostrophes, or you can't have spaces. So we could always manipulate this phrase and turn it into an acronym, something like this. This is still a 10-character password with a good mix of uppercase, lowercase, non-alphanumeric characters. It would satisfy many requirements of a password. Perhaps it might fall down in some places for not having a number. But the thing about password requirements is that there's no consensus as well. So trying to create a good, strong password on a website can become a bit of an exercise of trial and error. So there's some good strategies for creating fairly strong passwords. However, there remains a problem. And the problem is that most people then try and remember them. Now, don't forget, you need to have a different password for each service that you use, because even a very good, strong password puts you at risk if it's compromised in one of the places that you use it. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to recall which password has been used on which site? Let's take a look. Here's the simple truth with strong passwords. Your memory is just simply not very good. Let me give you an example. You might say that the passphrase we just looked at would be a good one to use on your LinkedIn account. That's great, but now we need a different one for Dropbox. So we make up something else. Again, it doesn't matter how silly the passphrase is, it just has to be something which is highly unlikely for anyone else to discover. And we'll make another one altogether for MySpace. So this is great. We've got these 3 strong passwords in the form of a passphrase, but we can't put them in memory. Okay, maybe you can put 3 in memory and you can recall them perfectly. But have a think about how many online accounts you actually have. It's almost certainly not 3, it's probably closer to 30 or even more, because these days we are required to create passwords in so many different places. So how are we going to create strong, unique ones and then not try and remember them? Well, there is one very simple answer. Some people joke about this, using a book to physically write your passwords in. But if using a book is the thing that helps you create unique passwords that are strong and you can retrieve them when required, that is a very good start. You have this risk, which is that someone may get their hands on the book, but they need physical access. This is not something that a hacker on the other side of the world can do. And frequently, when people are compromised online, it is from a long distance. It's someone from somewhere on the internet. So as a starting point, a book is actually not a bad idea, particularly if you keep it in a safe place at home. But there is a better way, and that's password managers. Let's go through the mechanics of what a password manager does. And the first thing is, it helps us generate passwords. Now, we've just been talking about passphrases, and they're a good way of actually having a password that you can enter again into a website. Some of them you may be able to commit to memory, other ones you may write down. But the whole premise of having a phrase is that it's something that our human minds can work with. When we move towards a password manager, we no longer have that constraint. So we can start to talk about generating genuinely random passwords. So for example, let's generate something with a length of 20 characters. Within those 20 characters, let's have 3 digits. And then we'll also have 3 symbols. If we were to generate genuinely random passwords using those criteria, we'd end up with things like this. These are very good passwords. They definitely pass the length test. They're also random and they're also unique. So the only problem we've got now is, how do we actually recall them? Well, this is really at the heart of what a password manager does, because we're going to take those passwords and encrypt them with what's referred to as a master password. So the master password is the one password that you actually need to remember. It's probably not going to look like one of those 3 passwords we just saw. It's going to be a passphrase or some other form of strong password that you can commit to memory. But you're only committing that one password to memory. And by doing so, you have the key to encrypt and decrypt every other password that you generate. Now, when you do that, the password is stored within a vault. Different password managers have different words for it, but for all intents and purposes, it is just an encrypted collection of your passwords. Crazy passwords, passwords that you would never be able to remember yourself, but now you don't have to because the password manager looks after it. Of course, you need to protect that master password very, very carefully, because that's the thing that will get you access to every single other password. But so long as you're using a reputable service and you've got a strong master password, password managers are enormously effective, and they're the best mechanism we have today for dealing with the reality of how we need to create and protect our passwords. Now, one more thing on passwords. Don't forget just how many places you have them. So for example, you have a password to unlock your phone. It may be a PIN, it may just be numbers, but it's still the same premise. It's still something that only you should know. If your phone isn't protected, we'll come back and talk about that a bit later on in the course. You should also have one on your PC, because you don't want anyone else just to be able to sit down at your PC and access all of your personal information. You don't want someone else in your house to be able to do that. You don't want someone who may steal your PC to be able to do that either. So passwords are pretty critical on a PC. Even your wireless network. Most of us have a Wi-Fi network at home now. Make sure you have a password on that, because you don't want a situation where someone else comes and logs on to your network and accesses your personal content and your internet connection. Your Wi-Fi password protects your entire network. And just like with the PC and the phone, we need to aim for these attributes of long, random, and unique passwords. So that's some password fundamentals. Let's now move on and talk about website security. Some of the riskiest digital activity that we perform in our lives is done in a web browser. A huge amount of malicious activity goes on in the browser, and it's really hard to make a judgment decision on which websites to trust. I just mentioned LinkedIn, Dropbox, and MySpace. Now, any reasonable person would trust these websites. They're very well recognized brands. We'd have no reason to be suspicious. But collectively, they lost nearly 600 million records because of security flaws in their websites. One of the problems that we have as everyday users of websites is that it's very hard to make judgment decisions about how secure the site is. In fact, there's really only one obvious independent means of verification of a website security profile. Let me show you what that is. Let's take Varonis as an example, and you'll see one indicator of security here in the browser, and it's the padlock at the start of the address bar. We can drill down into this padlock, and in the Chrome browser, I can click on Details for some more information. Here we can see the browser telling us that this page is secure because it has valid HTTPS. It then goes on and talks about certificates, which we can drill down and view, but we're not going to do that here. What I want to do is talk about what HTTPS is. Why are we seeing that green padlock? And indeed, why does it even matter? Let's go and take a look. HTTPS is a really important, really fundamental security control on the web. Let's talk about how it works. And in order to illustrate this, let's first think about what happens when a PC makes a request over the internet. So imagine the PC or the smartphone or the tablet that you're watching this course on at the moment. It's probably going to be connected to a Wi-Fi network. So your web traffic is going to go from the device that you're on now across a wireless network. Now, anyone controlling that wireless network can intercept the traffic. And that's just the start, because from there, the connection goes out via an ISP and then out over the internet and then eventually to the server that has loaded this content. Anyone who can get in the middle of any of that traffic can read any unencrypted traffic. We've seen many examples in the past of malicious activity such as rogue Wi-Fi hotspots. You think you're connected to the cafe or the airport or somewhere that should be perfectly legitimate, but someone with malicious intent is running it, and they're watching your traffic. ISPs are increasingly watching your traffic. And then as we get to the internet itself, that traffic goes through a number of different servers and often a number of different countries between the ISP and eventually the server. There are a lot of different points where we need to trust those that are handling the data. Now, what HTTPS does is gives us a mechanism where the traffic gets encrypted on the device itself before it even goes out over the wire, or the wireless as it may be. What that means is that when that traffic does leave the device, it's all encrypted. So all of these points between the PC and the server, where it's eventually decrypted, can't read the traffic. So you have confidentiality, no one else has seen your traffic, and they can't modify it either. So you have integrity. They haven't changed your traffic to say something else. Now that's really important when we talk about things like passwords. We don't want any of these other parties between your device and the site that you're talking to be able to see your password. When you browse a website like your bank, you want to be able to get back your balances, your account activity, without any of these parties being able to observe what's going on. And indeed, when you load those pages, you want to know that they haven't been tampered with. You want to know that an attacker hasn't put something malicious on a website that you've loaded. And this is one of the things that HTTPS does well. Now, none of this is to say that the server itself doesn't have serious security vulnerabilities on it. LinkedIn and Dropbox and MySpace all had HTTPS, but they also had some pretty serious security flaws on the server itself. So it's important to recognize what this padlock does and does not mean. Yes, it means your traffic is protected. No, it doesn't mean that the server itself is immune from any major problems. So that's HTTPS. Let's go and look at another really important service for protecting your online activity, and that's VPNs. A VPN, or a virtual private network, is another way of protecting your data as it flows across the internet. There are many consumer-orientated VPN products these days. VPNs that can run on your mobile devices and on your PC, and they often cost a mere few dollars a month. Let's talk about how they work. We'll go back to our PC, and again, it could also be a mobile device like a phone or a tablet, and the PC is connecting out over the internet. Now we know from the previous slide that in order to get to the internet, it probably goes through some Wi-Fi and it goes through an ISP, and then eventually that traffic ends up over on the destination server. Now let's imagine you do want to use Wi-Fi in a location that you can't completely trust. Imagine you're at an airport in a foreign country, and you can't necessarily rely on every service that you're using to implement HTTPS correctly. Many services still don't have it at all. So, being a cautious individual, you don't connect to the internet. Instead, you run a VPN client. So when you run a VPN in this fashion, you do have software that runs on your local device, and that's the client that we see here on the slide. That's just part of the picture, because you also need to have a VPN provider. Now, there are quite a number of good providers, and as I mentioned before, they're often just a few dollars a month. And what's going to happen when we run the VPN client on the device is it's going to encrypt the traffic all the way through to the VPN provider before it then goes out through the internet again and eventually to the target website. Now, there's a couple of important things to note here. One is that the Wi-Fi and the ISP are inside that encrypted traffic box. They cannot see your traffic when you have a VPN. The other thing to note though is that you are now trusting this VPN provider with your traffic, because they're going to decrypt it before they send it out over the internet. So you need to have a VPN provider that you trust. Now this isn't foolproof, so we still have a segment there of the connection after the VPN provider where the traffic is not necessarily encrypted. If you go to a website with HTTP in the address bar, it's still going to go through that point on the diagram without any protection. But if you have an HTTPS connection, as we just saw on the previous slide, then we know that's already encrypted. And now that encrypted communication is going to go through the VPN, which also encrypts it, and you get two levels of encryption. A VPN is a great solution for when you need that extra confidence that your traffic is encrypted. So that's the role of a VPN, and that's enough for encrypted traffic. Let's go on and have a look at something else that happens at an alarming rate on the web, and that's phishing attacks. Phishing attacks should be familiar to you because you have almost certainly received them in the past. You'll probably find that most phishing attacks that come via email just go straight to your junk mail, which is a good thing, but occasionally you may also see one make its way into your inbox. So let's go through how it works. You get an email from someone who's ultimately running a scam, and the email entices you to go to a phishing page. So this is just a website, but it's going to ask for some very particular information. We'll have a look at one in a moment. You fill in the information requested on the phishing page. So for example, your PayPal credentials, that's a popular phishing scam. And those credentials are then sent off to an attacker. So they've now got your PayPal username and password. That sounds very simple, and it is. Phishing attacks are normally extremely trivial, but they're also very effective. Let me give you an example of a phishing email. I literally received this one today into my inbox. This is precisely the email I received. And when you have a look at this mail, you realize that there's a few things that just don't add up. So firstly, it's representing itself as having come from Microsoft, yet there's no Microsoft branding, which would be quite unusual for an email from a company like that. The grammar is also bad. It says, your account will reactivated. Very unusual for a company like Microsoft to get their grammar so bad. There's also a sense of urgency. It's prompting me into action. Someone would read this and say, well, yes, I would actually like to reactivate my email account. And phishing scams frequently rely on this human vulnerability, which is responding to a sense of urgency. Now, this is quite frankly a pretty bad looking phishing email, although it did actually make its way into my inbox. When you see an email like this, it's important just to delete it. Don't click on any links. Often these links will actually track who's clicked on them. And in doing so, you've just verified that you are a real person receiving these messages and you're willing to click links. Not just that, but you may then end up on a website, which may be worse than just trying to extract information from you. It may also load malicious software into your browser that exploits out-of-date applications on your machine. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. For now though, let me go and show you another phishing scam email and an easy way to check whether it's legitimate or not. This one is actually quite a bit more convincing than the one I just showed you. It's allegedly from PayPal. It's got the PayPal branding. It's presented in a much nicer way. But there's one obvious sign that this is a phishing attack. I've received this on my iPhone and I have tapped and held on the link in the email. Now you've got to be careful here because I just mentioned you don't want to actually click on it and load the page. But by clicking and holding, I've been able to see a little indication of where that link actually goes. We can see here that it goes to an address which is bit.ly. Now bit.ly is a URL shortener, and what that means is that behind this link there's another link, and that's going to take me somewhere completely different. They've used bit.ly here to obfuscate or hide the URL that we would go to if we clicked on it normally. And that is a dead giveaway. If you get an email from a company like PayPal and the links don't go to paypal.com, you know it's almost certainly going to be a phishing scam. Let's now have a look at just what a phishing page looks like. Here's the one that's loaded from that Microsoft Outlook phishing scam I showed you earlier. And this is a very good looking phishing page. It looks like a normal Microsoft sign-in page. It's got the Microsoft branding, it's asking for email address and password, and pretty much everything looks normal. Until you look at the address bar and you see that this is not Microsoft.com and it's not anything that looks anything like Microsoft.com. Not only that, but there's no padlock, and we know now that if there is no padlock, we can't trust the page. This phishing page is actually running on a compromised website. So this is someone else's website that attackers have broken into and loaded this malicious page onto. If you get an email from a website like PayPal asking you to log into your account, don't click any links at all. Open up your browser and type in the address yourself, paypal.com. You know that's where they are. You'll be able to find any calls to action after you log in. So that's websites. Let's move on now and have a chat about software maintenance. Here's one that you probably don't normally think about, but you may have asked yourself this next question in the past. If you have asked yourself this question, it's probably because you've felt bombarded by software products asking you to update them. Let me show you what I mean. I recently started up a computer that I hadn't used for a while, and as soon as I fired it up, my software started prompting me with things like this. My password manager was out of date. Would I like to download the new version? Skype popped up as well. There was a new version of Skype. The VPN product I use, that also wanted an update. And even the product that I use to take these screen grabs asked me to update it. There were all sorts of different software products on the machine begging for new versions to be loaded. Many people will wonder why this happens, and indeed they'll wonder if it really matters. What if I say, ignore it? Will it go away? And are there any negative consequences from not taking the update? Let's start by having a look at some of the reasons software is continually asking for updates like these. I want to talk about 3 primary reasons why we keep seeing messages like the ones we just saw on the previous slide. The first is that very often software does get new enhancements. It's improved. There'll be a new feature or something will run more efficiently. The software manufacturer has improved the product and they want to give you the latest version. This is usually a good thing. Another reason, and this is a very common one for software updates, is bug fixes. So something within the software product has not been working properly and they've fixed it. Now it may not be something that you've seen, it may not be an obvious flaw, it may not be one in a feature that you use. Very often, these flaws only expose themselves under very specific circumstances. The reality is that software can be very complex. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of lines of code, a lot of interdependencies, and bugs are inevitable. All software has bugs. And if a manufacturer is coming forth and saying, hey, we've fixed some stuff, and there's an update, then that is also normally a very good thing. But there's a third item, and this is particularly relevant to this course, and that's security flaws. Because software is so complex, not only do we have bugs that might impact, say, functionality, we have bugs that can leave software vulnerable. Now, these security flaws can come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. They can have very different risks. At best, it may be nothing more than a minor inconvenience. At worst, it may mean your personal data being compromised or attackers even taking control of your PC. That's usually about as bad as it gets with security flaws. And we have seen this time and time again too. We've seen very serious security flaws in very well-known software. Let me give you an example. This is a list of just very recent security vulnerabilities in the Java runtime environment. Now, you may have used Java in your browser before. Not so much these days, but particularly in the past, there are many websites that were dependent on running Java within your web browser, and it has a long history of having some pretty serious security vulnerabilities. It's not just Java. We've seen security vulnerabilities with Adobe Flash, with Microsoft Silverlight, and not just with software that runs in your browser, but pretty much any software you can conceive of. The big problem, though, with vulnerable software that does run in your browser is it leaves you open to vulnerabilities that can be exploited just by visiting a website. Now, this is one of the big reasons that Java and Flash and Silverlight are disabled in modern browsers. Those plugins left us especially vulnerable, and we're now reaching a point in time where we just simply don't need them. The thing to leave you with on this slide, though, is that when people did not keep these products up to date, they faced some really serious risks that could manifest themselves simply by browsing a website. But let's move on. Let's talk about how we stay on top of this. So how do we keep our software up to date? How do we maintain it? Let's go and talk about updates. Here's a really good example, and if you're a Windows user, you may have seen this. Then again, you may not have, because the beauty about the way Windows updates itself is it happens very seamlessly in the background. For many years, Windows has had the Windows Update facility, and this is a process that regularly checks to see if there is new software available that can be installed on your PC. When there is, it will begin downloading and installing. And very often this happens silently. So that is, it doesn't require any interaction from you. You may have noticed sometimes when you reboot your PC, it says that the system is updating. If you leave your PC turned on long enough without rebooting, you may actually be asked to restart it in order for the installation to complete. This is a great way of taking security updates because they don't require interaction. Let's look at another model. It's really important that any sorts of updates, whether they're fixes for security or bug fixes or new features, happen seamlessly. The way Apple does it with iOS is excellent. This is the way my iPhone is configured. I have it set up to automatically take updates to apps. Now, we just saw in the previous slide how Windows was updating the operating system. This is an example of every application on the device being regularly updated. What I love about this is that when I've got iOS set to take updates, I go to bed, my phone is on power, it's on the Wi-Fi, and it just happens in the middle of the night. Most of the time, I don't even know it. And this is one of the great things about software updates today as compared to years gone by. It used to be that every update was a very manual process, required planning and testing, and as a result, it frequently didn't happen. These days, it literally happens while you sleep. It should happen while you sleep. Make sure that your apps are updating. So far, I've just been talking about operating systems and apps and software that we're all probably pretty familiar with. But increasingly, we're seeing software running in places that we've never seen it before. IoT, or the Internet of Things. This is the premise that we should start connecting everything to the internet because internet makes them better. And in many cases, it does. There are some really excellent devices out there that are better by virtue of connectivity. But it also poses all new problems. So for example, you're looking at LIFX light bulbs. And the LIFX light bulbs had a bit of a security problem. there was a bug that would expose the Wi-Fi passwords of the network that it was connected to. Now, this is a serious bug in the software of the light globes, so it needed a fix. And this should now start to get you thinking. How do you update your IoT things? So have a think about the sorts of IoT devices that you may well have in your home. Things like webcams. Have you ever updated your webcam software? Do you know how your webcam updates its software itself, if at all? Webcams are a particularly common source of pretty serious security vulnerabilities. Is it actually being maintained? Smart TVs are another very popular IoT device in the home. How are they being maintained? Not just maintained now either, but think about how long you expect your TV to last. Will the software still be maintained when the TV's 7 years old? Maybe a decade old? That could leave you quite vulnerable. Thermostats are another very popular IoT device these days. Do you know how your thermostat is updating its software? Could your thermostat be doing the same thing as the LiftX light bulb and leaking the credentials to your Wi-Fi network? Wi-Fi power switches are another good example. I've got one on my coffee machine so that it turns itself on in the morning before I get up. I recently updated the software running on it, and the only way I could do it was to open the app on my mobile device. And that's not something I normally do. It was only when I opened the app one day to change a setting that I realized that it actually needed a software update. Security systems in the home is another one. We're seeing all sorts of physical security devices now connected to the internet. How do you update those? And just for one more example, cars. We are seeing cars become part of the Internet of Things. They run software, they talk over the internet, and occasionally they're going to have bugs as well. How does your car update its software? Let me show you one example. This is the software update on a Tesla. And in fact, what's happening here is that within the vehicle, you can define when that software update is applied. Now, we almost need to take a step back here and remember just how far we've come. This is a car that connects over the internet and downloads new versions of software to do all three of those things we just saw before. Add new features, fix bugs, and resolve security problems. It can be configured to talk to your Wi-Fi, take those updates outside of normal operating hours, apply them while you're sleeping, and then be ready to run when you get up and use it. This is a great example of how seamlessly our IoT things can update themselves. But do take a moment just to think about how many other devices you've got in your house that may not be updating themselves at all, that may actually be vulnerable and leave you at risk. So that's software maintenance. It's not a particularly glamorous part of security, but it certainly is an important one. Let's now move on and start talking about mobile devices. It's easy to forget what life was like before we had mobile devices. I mean, mobile devices in the form of smartphones that we have today. It's not that long ago that we didn't have powerful computers in our pockets with big touchscreens connected to the internet. But these days, we're rarely without them. We have our entire lives in these phones. But think about this for a moment. Ask yourself this question. Start to go through in your mind all the things that you have on your phone. Your call history, your messages, photos of your kids, applications that you're logged into, your Facebook, your email. And it's worse than someone else just being able to read your email, because if they can receive email, they can start to do things like reset passwords on your other accounts. And even if you have multi-step verification on those accounts, and you need to receive an SMS in order to do something like reset it, they've got your phone, the thing that receives the SMS. They can start to communicate with your friends as though they were you. A vulnerable phone in the hands of a malicious person can be absolutely devastating. And right now, whilst you still have your phone, is the time to think about how to properly secure it. Let's go and take a look at that. This is my iPhone, and like many of you out there, I have a photo of my son as the wallpaper of my device, and that's just one of many very personal things I have on my phone. But as you can also see, my phone requires me to press home to unlock. I can't get into this phone until it is unlocked. Anyone who picks this device up and wants to get into it is going to need to go to this screen. Now they need a passcode, and until they enter the correct passcode, they're simply not going to be able to access this phone. Now this probably sounds very fundamental, very simple, and it is. Yet so many devices don't have this basic security setting. People don't turn on the requirement for a passcode because it gets in the way. This again comes back to this intersection of convenience versus security. And make no mistake, it is inconvenient to have to enter a PIN every single time you want to unlock the phone. Now, I'm not going to do that here because if I did, then, well, you'd see the PIN, and that would sort of defy the point of needing this secret in order to get into the phone. But that's also one of the issues we have with PINs. Shoulder surfing. People looking over someone else's shoulder, watching what happens on the phone. Now, that might be sitting in an office, it might be standing on a train, but if you're having to enter your secret into a big touchscreen in close proximity to other people, then that is a privacy risk. Now, I've got a modern iPhone, so there's a better way of doing this. Let me show you. I'm going to do a biometric logon. And what you'll see is that whilst I'm here on the home screen of my phone, the locked home screen, I'm just going to touch the home button with my thumb and I'm immediately logged on. Now that was in real time. It's very, very simple. In fact, it's even easier than that on a modern iPhone. I'm going to lock the phone again, and this time all I'm going to do, whilst the phone is locked and the screen is blank, is just touch and hold my thumb on the home button, and that was it. I'm in. It is literally now as easy as picking up your phone to also unlock it using your unique fingerprint. Now this is great because it removes the usability barrier and it lets us do a few pretty neat things. So for one, a device like this continually locks itself. Every time I turn it off, it locks. Older phones that I've had without modern versions of the operating system and modern biometrics used to have a timeout. So I'd set it to say 3 minutes. If the phone is left unattended for 3 minutes, it will lock it automatically. Now that of course left a bit of a problem. I could have put my phone down, turned around, someone else picks it up and then gets in there. Now, because the friction of unlocking it is so low, it can lock immediately. Now, I don't want to focus too much on iOS or Apple's iPhone because there are many other devices out there that can do biometric authentication. But even if you don't have biometrics, at least have the PIN. You are going to have a higher usability barrier and you're going to have that shoulder surfing risk, but it is so much better than having nothing at all because that just leaves your phone as a free-for-all for anyone that can get their hands on it. So that's the physical security of our phone. What protects it when someone actually holds it in their hand? That's obviously really important. But let's go and take a look at another risk. And that's the software that you run on your device. I want to focus on this image for a moment. And this is a QR barcode scanner code reader from the Google Play App Store. Now there's nothing remarkable about having a QR code reader in the App Store. But what's particularly interesting about this one is the permissions that it requires to operate. Now think about this for a moment. A QR code scanner needs to be able to use the camera on the device to read the QR code and then it needs to be able to read the data within it. Yet, when we look at this app, it's asking for access to things like your calendar, your contacts, your location. Why? Why does a QR code scanner need this? Look, there are some arguments that it could be valuable for certain purposes that would require access to your contacts or your calendar. But the bigger problem is that when someone goes to take this application from the App Store, and it is in the Google Play Store, there is one thing that they will be focusing on this screen. And it's the one thing that's sitting between them and actually starting to scan QR codes. And that's the accept button. People so frequently just jump to the path of least resistance. They're looking at what's the fastest, easiest way I can do what I want to do. And messages such as this, which do actually appear a bit risky, tend to be ignored. There are many malicious attacks mounted by applications that request excessive permissions. So you need to look at the apps that you're loading onto your device, and whether it's an Android or an iPhone or any other sort of device, if it's asking for particular permissions, you've got to ask yourself the question, am I actually happy to give that app that amount of access to my device? And if you're not, go and find another one. Now, while we're talking about app stores, let's go and talk about something else that's really important when you're loading apps onto one of your devices. This is a really fundamentally simple principle, and it's this: use official app stores. If you've got an Android, get your apps from the Google Play Store. If you've got an iPhone, get your apps from the Apple App Store. They've both got more than 1 million apps each. There is no shortage of apps in the official App Store. And when you take apps from there, you know that they've been reviewed by Google and by Apple. And they're in that App Store because they've passed rigorous software quality controls. Now, that's not to say they're going to be perfect. We've still seen incidents of malicious software from the official app stores. But you can have a significantly higher degree of confidence that these apps are going to be legitimate when they come from an authoritative source. This is actually one of the things that makes modern-day smartphones and tablets so secure compared to the traditional mechanism of loading software onto, say, a PC. So you think about it. It's very easy to just download any software from the internet and run it on your PC. That's pretty much the way most software installation happens on Windows and on Macs today. But what the app stores have done for mobile devices is given us this great managed, controlled ecosystem where you can have a much higher degree of confidence in the integrity of these apps. Usually, when we see malicious apps running on a device, it's because they haven't been loaded from the official stores. There are a variety of reasons why people might do that, but the fact remains that when it hasn't gone through the mainstream channel, you're at a much higher degree of risk. So that's several things to look at with mobile devices. Making sure you have a PIN, trying to use biometrics, and being very careful about permissions and where you actually take your apps from. Let's now go and move on to the final module and talk about the Internet of Things. I spoke briefly about the Internet of Things, or IoT as we often refer to it, in the earlier module on software maintenance. And this was the principle of let's connect these everyday things we have to the internet, and that will give us new features or new ways of using the thing that forms part of IoT. But this is also causing us some pretty serious problems. Let me give you an example of just how bad it can get. This is a child in his bedroom being monitored via an IoT webcam. And in this particular incident, a stranger managed to hack into the webcam, which was being used as a baby monitor, and talk to the child at night. Now, this is a terrifying concept. And imagine the reaction of the parents where they have a young child saying, "I keep hearing a strange person talk to me at night." And the parents would have inevitably been dismissive, a child's imagination. And it seems inconceivable that someone would actually have compromised a webcam in a child's bedroom and tormented them late at night. But this is what happened in this case, and it's certainly not an isolated case either. And the problem is that there are many webcams out there that are ripe for this sort of attack. But how does it actually happen? How does an attacker manage to get hold of a webcam and start talking to a kid in his bedroom? Let's take a look. There are 3 key steps I want to talk about here, and unfortunately they are pretty trivial, which explains why it does happen with alarming regularity. Now, the first one is discoverability, and this speaks to the fact that it's easy to scan the entire internet for IoT things. Individuals can do it from their own machine, and there are services out there that will do it for them. So, for example, there are services that list all sorts of different IoT connected devices. It's simply an index of what's on the internet. That index includes publicly facing webcams. There are other services out there that are somewhat more nefarious, and their sole purpose is to go and index webcams and make them accessible to other people. So that's the first bit. It's not hard to find them. The second point here is that many webcams are overexposed. So there are certainly cases where people buy a webcam with the intention of making it publicly accessible, but in many cases people are caught out unawares. They buy a webcam, they put it in their home for purposes such as monitoring the kids, and then without realizing it, they've made it publicly facing. So of course, once they do that, we come back to that discoverability point where it's now easy to find. The third problem that makes things even worse is the passwords that are used on these devices. Now, those passwords can be weak. We spoke about that earlier on in the course. It's going to be something poor like the dog's name. In many cases, it's the default password that the manufacturer put on the device. And one of the problems we've got with internet-connected devices is the same default password being used on every single one of them. That's an alarmingly common occurrence. And once an attacker knows what the default password is for a particular device, if they come across that device somewhere, then that's the first password they're going to test. Even worse though, is that in many cases the password is missing altogether. It's extremely easy to find publicly facing webcams that just simply have no requirement for the user to enter a username and a password at all. And this is what makes it so easy for attackers to get access to webcams. It's not just webcams though. There is a lot of stuff we're connecting to the internet that's starting to make a lot of trouble for us. Let me give you some examples. I've picked just a very small handful of IoT devices that we've already seen serious security incidents with. So for example, the LIFX light bulbs. I mentioned those a little bit earlier on in the course. Now, the problem with LIFX, as I mentioned, was that it was actually leaking the Wi-Fi passwords of the network. And this is an important thing to remember with IoT. Many people think that a security incident with something like a light bulb would be a problem that really didn't go any further. It's just the light bulb. So maybe an attacker could turn the lights on and off rapidly, change the color, do something else that doesn't exceed the boundaries of that IoT device itself. But when it's leaking the Wi-Fi credentials, then the scope of risk suddenly grows quite dramatically. It's not just LIFX though, we've seen the same problem with the iKettle. This is a connected kettle, and the connected kettle was doing the same thing. It was leaking the credentials of the Wi-Fi network it had been connected to. So again, as with the light bulb, it's not just a risk to your coffee and tea making ability, it's a risk to your entire network. The same thing happened again with the Ring doorbell. So this is a doorbell with a built-in webcam so that you can remotely see who's at your door. It's a great concept. Connectivity is genuinely a feature that makes the doorbell better. But in this case, it also gave up the credentials to the network which it was connected to. Moving on to something a little bit different is webcams and digital video recorders created by Xingmai. Now, the interesting thing here is that Xingmai actually creates the chips that go into other people's webcams and DVRs. But the significance here is that in late 2016, these devices were found to have been compromised by attackers and were being used in the hundreds of thousands to launch attacks on other websites. So this was literally attackers using cameras and video recorders in people's homes to try and take down large websites. And it was enormously effective as well. Now, this was a problem with default credentials on the device. And unfortunately, it was hard-coded into the devices as well. So these actually needed to be recalled. And one final one is the Nissan Leaf. Now, this is actually a vulnerability which I reported. And it was one that was discovered whilst I was running a workshop. And someone in my class actually found that they could use the mobile app that comes with their car to control the climate control features of other cars. Not only that, but they could pull back the battery status of other cars, the trip history of other cars. And that then started to cause privacy problems, as well as the fact that you really don't want someone actually controlling physical functions in your vehicle. All of these things could be made both better and worse due to connectivity. Now that then raises the following question for consumers. Now this is really quite a difficult question, and think about it in the context of a vehicle like the Nissan Leaf. When someone goes in to buy that vehicle and they want to use that internet connected feature, how do they know if it's secure? Of course, everyone has the same reasonable expectation that when they buy an item like a car, it will actually be secure. No one expects to have security vulnerabilities. But obviously, many times they do. The real problem with all this is that there simply is no way to know for sure. If you're looking at buying a connected car or kettle or any number of other things that can now talk over the internet, it is impossible to tell in advance if it's going to have serious security problems or not. However, there are a number of things you can do to reduce the risk when you do connect an IoT thing to the internet. Let's take a look at those now. The first one is simply this. Consider what you connect. There are many devices that you buy today which come with internet connectivity, but you may not actually require it. A perfect example is the amplifier in my home cinema has internet connectivity. I don't know why. I don't know what it does when it's connected to the internet. And as best I can tell, it doesn't really offer me any functional upside by plugging it in. So it's simply not connected. I cannot have my home amplifier compromised via the internet if it's not connected to the internet in the first place. So begin there. Think about, do you really need to plug the thing in? The next thing is to consider the exposure of the IoT thing. The webcams were a perfect example. In that story where the man was talking to the child in his bedroom, did that webcam really need to be exposed over the internet? Earlier on, I mentioned that I have a Wi-Fi power switch for my coffee machine. I could expose that over the internet so that if, hypothetically, I wanted to turn the coffee machine on whilst I was out, I could do it. But that really isn't something I need to do. And by consciously not exposing that IoT thing publicly, that's going to reduce the risk footprint that it has. I'm not going to have someone outside of my home ever able to access that switch. And finally, thinking about how much you share. So being conscious that an IoT thing is usually collecting data and is very often sending it back to the internet. I'll give you one more personal example here. I have some IoT security cameras in my home. They use the service provided by the manufacturer to store video in the cloud that I can review remotely. Now, for a security camera, that actually makes a lot of sense because you want to be able to see what's going on in your home whilst you're away. But when I installed them at home, I made a really conscious decision about what information the devices were going to collect. And that was as simple as deciding which direction to point them in. I don't point them in directions where my kids spend most of their time. I don't point them in any private areas of the house which I wouldn't want exposed publicly. I have them pointed outdoors, at yards, at places which, for all intents and purposes, are publicly accessible. And I do that simply because if the worst does happen, and someone actually gains access to that footage, the damage to me is minimized. So these 3 pieces of advice here are things that are very pragmatic and very simple to implement. It just requires a bit of common sense and a bit of forward thinking in terms of how to minimize your risk of running IoT devices. I want to look at one more thing that gives you a bit of insight into where we're heading in the world of IoT. This is a Lixil Satis Smart Toilet. It is a connected toilet. Now, I've said a couple of times in this course that IoT is about connecting everyday items in the hope of somehow making them better. In this case, the toilet comes with a companion app. So you can run up the My Satis application and control various features of the toilet. Now, I don't want to go into too much graphic detail, but this is more than just your average toilet. It is a rather full-featured device. However, as with so many of the IoT things that we've seen in this course, the Satis did end up having a security vulnerability. And it was this. When you think about the sorts of things that can go wrong in your life due to security problems, this probably wasn't one of the first things that came to mind. But it is a good illustration of where we're heading in terms of just how much risk we're introducing into our everyday lives. And it is hard to imagine a more distressing security vulnerability than this one. On that note, let's move on and summarize the course. Let's do a brief summary of the course, and I want to go back and touch on the 5 different modules that we looked at and some of the key takeaways from each. Firstly, passwords. We know how we should make strong passwords. They should be long, random, and unique. And the reality of it is, in order to do that, you're going to need to use something other than your brain. You're going to need a password manager or even just writing them down in a book and storing it somewhere safe. But more importantly than anything, it's to make sure that the strength of those passwords is good, because they are so frequently the source of serious security risks today. Website security. I talked about HTTPS, and it's one of the only things that you can independently verify in terms of security on a website. So seeing that padlock in the address bar is enormously valuable. But we've also got to be clear that it's simply giving us confidence about encryption of the traffic, not about the quality of the website it's connecting to. VPNs are another really useful way of securing your connection, particularly when you're in an environment where you may not trust, say, the network that you're connecting to. We also talked about phishing sites and some of the obvious signs of how to spot them. Badly worded emails, missing branding, linking through to websites that don't appear to be the official site. Software maintenance. It's not a glamorous part of security. It can be quite mundane, but many of our good modern-day operating systems and applications have mechanisms of self-updating. Now, this is really important because along with the new features and bug fixes you get with software updates, you also often see serious security risks fixed. So it's important to stay up to date, but it's also important to think about how all the various things around you, running software, update themselves. Do your IoT things self-update? That's a worthwhile thing to check. on mobile devices, the most important lesson out of that entire module was to lock them. And I know that sounds like obvious advice, but it so frequently doesn't happen. And fortunately these days we can lock them not just with a PIN, but increasingly devices are supporting biometric authentication, which actually makes it extremely easy to have both a secure device and a convenient user experience. I also touched on limiting those app permissions. Don't install apps that are asking for permissions to do excessive things, and always take those apps from the official app store of your device. And finally, we just talked about IoT, the Internet of Things. And we saw many examples of everyday items getting connectivity and then having serious security vulnerabilities as a result. So think carefully about what IoT devices you have that you actually need to connect. And if you do they need to be publicly facing? And can you minimize the amount of information that they collect and then share with the web? IoT is forging ahead into all sorts of unexpected places. We finished on a very unexpected place in that module. It's an exciting time, but it also poses some pretty serious risks. So that's everything we covered, and I do hope that this has been a useful course for you that's given you some tangible, actionable items that you can take away to secure your digital footprint. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Troy Hunt.